Welcome. I'm Patricia Sargent, your host for Industry Insiders, the show in which we chat with people who work primarily behind the scenes supporting literature and literacy. On this episode, we're chatting with Latoya Smith, founder of LCS Literary Services. Latoya is an award-winning literary agent and editor. She's a consultant and developmental editor who works with USA Today and New York Times best-selling authors. And, full disclosure, Latoya used to be my editor. What genres do you represent, and what appeals to you about those genres?
Sure. So actually I try to represent genres that I personally am interested in, which if any of you have known me from my Hachette days, it hasn't changed that much. So when it comes to fiction, women's fiction, that is my thing. It's always been my thing. Any subgenre of women's fiction, that's me. From thrillers, suspense, just contemporary women's fiction, some historical, not too much, but if it deals with The Vanishing Half and like that type of historical, or The Yellow Wife, I do enjoy those type of historical novels. I don't really do any sci-fi fantasy. I don't do any paranormal fiction, don't really do horror. Like, I have currently one horror author, but that's because I so fell in love with his book because it reminded me of the first season of True Detective, if anyone has watched that show. And so I fell in love with that particular novel, but typically I don't, really do any horror. And I do romance, of course. And so that's predominantly what I do for fiction, upmarket commercial women's fiction. When it comes to nonfiction, I used to do a lot of memoir. I don't do as much because they're really hard to sell unless there's some big angle or hook or, motivational piece to it. But I do have some memoir. I do a lot of prescriptive nonfiction, from personal finance to entrepreneurship to spiritual healing, health and wellness. I do political books and social justice books. One of my biggest books actually coming out is by Kimberly Jones called How We Can Win. It's coming out with Halt. And that was a book that I got personally invested in because of her speech. And she's a good friend of mine, disclaimer. And so I became her agent before that speech went viral. But that is one I'm so excited about, having known her and seeing her journey as an activist to get this book out. Another book I'm really excited about is from a client named Gordon Braxton, who writes a book about teaching young boys how to avoid rape culture, which I think is so important because most of the books out there about rape is about what women can do to not be victims, but not about, training our boys to not be predators. So it's called Empowering Young Boys to Avoid Rape Culture. So, those type of books that, I'm personally invested in and interested in, love it. Pop culture books, don't do a ton of cookbooks, but depending on the author, I'm definitely interested in it if it's like cookbook mixed with some kind of narrative. And I'm starting to do more like personal essays, but again, the author has to be established because without, having an established platform, sometimes personal essays are a little difficult to sell. But that's pretty much what I'm looking for. Also, I most recently read a book called Arsenic and Adobo that I loved.
Oh, me and myself.
Yeah. So I'm actually starting to look for some cozy mystery, which isn't usually my thing, but that book was so cute.
My gosh. Okay, literary agents and publishers are considered like the gatekeepers of traditional publishing because traditionally readers would only have access to the books that agents and publishers believed were good enough to be published. As an agent, what are you looking for when you're evaluating a story? You mentioned that when you're reading it, it helps if editors pop in your mind. But for the story, what are you looking for?
Yeah. So with fiction, it just really has to draw me in, which is probably why I don't do like mystery, a lot of mystery or a lot of horror or sci-fi, because I think it takes a while for those stories to build up. And I am not a take a while for the story to build up kind of person. Like, I want to jump in from chapter one. And maybe that's because romance books have spoiled me, because I feel like in romances, you kind of jump right into it with the meet cute, usually in chapter one. And so that is the type of reader I am. Like, when I'm looking at queries, the first thing I want to see, number one, is the word count what I'm looking for, and then do I know the comps? If I don't know the comp titles, or which is basically the books that the author is comparing themselves to, if I don't know them, then that's probably a good pointer that I'm not the right person for it. But if I see that the word count is what my publishers are looking for, and the comps are like right in line with what I can identify with, and I'm familiar with the marketing and the marketplace, then I'll keep reading. If the description of the book sounds interesting, meaning it's just personally interesting to me, it's something I like to read, or it's something I know will sell, or it just sounds good, then I'll kind of jump to the sample pages and see if the writing holds up with what you describe in your query letter. Once I look at that, then I'll look at the synopsis and see where you're going to take the story. And if all those things match up, that's when I'll request more. Now, if you're an established author and you've got a track record, then you may not have any more than that. And so then I would have to talk to you on the phone, because I want to know what it is you've done, what you're doing, what your sales are. All of these things come into play when you're trying to shop a project. And that'll also determine if you need a full book versus just a few sample chapters. So that's kind of my process on the story, and again, if I request the full, sometimes writers will polish those first couple of chapters and the rest of the book falls apart. I've had that happen. Or I just don't fall in love with the story. Sometimes it's not always, this was wrong and this was wrong and this was wrong. Sometimes it's just not my personal taste, or it just is boring to me, or I can't get into it. And so I try not to give too much critical feedback unless I really like it. And I'm like, if you do blah, 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 I would love to kind of see it again. But in most cases, I kind of know if it's for me or not for me from that query and sample. And then that kind of lets me know what I want to take on. And again, this is why it's cool, being an editor and an agent, because sometimes, not so much anymore, unfortunately, because I'm so busy now, I don't have as much time to do editing. But this would be the time where I would say, listen, if you pitch other agents and it doesn't find a home and you want to do some work on it, you could come back to me, I'll edit it for you, and then you can kind of go to other agents and see if you can make it work, so that I don't cross. Because, if I take you on as an agent, technically I would be helping you to edit it as part of my commission. So I try not to double dip, and I'm very upfront. Like, as an agent, you're paying this. As an editor, it would be this. And so I allow them to kind of choose how they want to use me. In some cases, they're like, I'll pay you to edit. I need an editor anyway. And if you like it, feel free to represent me, so but I try not to do that. I do have a few clients where that has happened, but I do try to keep the businesses separate. And now I actually have editors that work with me. So most of the projects I'm getting in now are edited by them. Super. And I'm just kind of overseeing everything, because I have, like I said, almost 30 clients. So I have to make sure that they have my full attention.
Right. It's so interesting the way that what you've just explained to us about your reaction to the story ties back to what you were saying before, that authors need to find representation both on the agency side and the editorial side that is enthusiastic toward their project.
Absolutely.
So that would be ingredient one.
Yes. And I've unfortunately had, clients where I have to block them. I know, not clients, sorry, authors.
Oh.
Because I have we have a portal where all of our submissions run through, and it will red flag us if you keep trying to send the same project over and over. And we have, authors who are repeat offenders, if you will, who, if they don't get the response they want, they will just literally every week, they'll just keep sending it over and over and over again. And that's not the way to do it. You know what I mean? Like, and also just a word of advice for those who are, querying. If an agent or editor does not specifically say, hey, if you do these 5 things, or if you revise, I would love to see it. 9 times out of 10, they probably don't want to see it again. And so you should probably look for other people to send it to, even if you do a revision. Now, of course, if this is like your dream person and you want to try one more time and there's been 5 or 6 months, et cetera, that has passed between your first pitch and this one, by all means, or if you meet them somewhere and you want to try to, see if you can get it in with them again, that's cool. But for the most part, once it's a no, it's probably a no. And unless they ask for it again, it's probably a no. And one thing that we do at Art House, which I think is really cool, because I know sometimes it's nerve-wracking to figure out, well, am I sending it to the right person? And then what if I send it to the wrong person? Do I have a chance to send it to someone else? And so at Art House, we have to have 3 rejections before it's officially passed on for the agency. And that way you kind of know that, all right, everybody's probably looked at it at this point and it's probably not right for this agency versus this agent.
Yeah. In the publishing industry, there have been quite a few mergers, like Penguin Random House, and there's that ongoing discussion of Simon and Schuster merging with Penguin. You personally, what are your thoughts about these types of publishing mergers?
I think the biggest concern, it's twofold. One, you're limiting the options, and so if Hachette has one identity, Penguin has one identity, Simon and Schuster has one identity, and then they all have different divisions within them. Your options, there's way more options of who you can send it to. But once they all kind of start melding together, you hope that they will maintain separate identities, but sometimes that makes for less people that you can send it to, less options that you can send it to. And then also the sad reality is, like with any merger of any company, eventually you're going to get rid of the excess. So there's going to be less editors, period, in the market, because many of them are going to get laid off. And a lot of them may decide not to return or not to look for other jobs. So in my opinion, those are the 2 main issues, that you're limiting the amount of eyeballs or the amount of opportunities for that project by, all these companies kind of merging together, which is why the DOJ is trying to stop the merger of SNS, because it'll ultimately give PRH like a monopoly, and how Americans feel about monopolies, right? So that's one part of it. But then again, the second part of it is that when all the smoke settles, and they, not saying it will happen, but so far, that's generally what happens. Once things settle down, it's like, well, we have now 3 of the same person. We have 4 of the same person. And then these massive layoffs come across. And so now you have less editors, less options, less opportunities. And so, that's the fear of it. Now, so far with PRH, they've been pretty good at keeping their separate identities. They haven't crossed over a ton. Like, I've still actually met even more editors now with them, which is exciting. They're hiring more people, which is exciting. So I'm hoping that if they do, if the sale goes through, that SNS will remain SNS and they'll have their own identity. But again, you don't really know until the smoke settles,
Right. The first thing that came into my mind when I heard that Penguin Random House was considering merging with Simon and Schuster was that there would be fewer books for readers. We won't have that same, the competition limits the types of books that, with less competition comes less variety in the books available to readers. That was my first
and
concern.
book budgets, because now if they're all under the same house, do they have the same budget for what they can acquire? Or is that now going to be melded into the overall PRH budget? I mean, just again, you don't know until it all kind of smooths out, and then it's like you just got to deal with whatever comes with it, you know.
How do you determine whether a story is marketable when you get the submission from the author?
Yeah. So the first indicator is, like I mentioned before, those comp titles, making sure they're 3 to 5 years old. And newer is better, but at the very least, they can be older than 3 to 5 years old, because as we know, the market is constantly changing. And so if those comps are strong, especially for fiction, then it's like, okay, this is pretty much a shoo-in, especially if the publisher is known for this particular thing, or I know this editor would love this particular thing. So, or, this is booming right now on the bestsellers list. This is a big TV film opportunities. Like, those are the kind of things that I look for fiction. For nonfiction, it really is based on the platform of the author and whether or not what they have to talk about is marketable. Because I think back when I was working at Hachette, reality TV was a big thing, and publishers were paying these people lots of money to do these books. And then they realized, that audience is not necessarily a book buying audience, and they lost a lot of money because people like to watch them on TV, but don't necessarily want to spend $25 to read their books. So that's something I have to think about when I'm taking on nonfiction, is not only, who are they, but what is it they have to say? And is that, something the book buying audience wants to hear? And so again, it all relates back to what sells. Numbers, numbers, numbers. And I think if authors in particular understand that, when you're trying to get acquired, it is a numbers game, and a publisher or an editor has to run a profit and loss statement to see how many copies is this book going to sell, and then kind of work backwards to how much money the publisher is going to make, at which point they figure out how much money to offer you as an advance. And so this is why we stress having your comps and knowing, exactly what it is that you're selling, because they then go and run numbers on these books to determine advance royalties. And so, that's why comps are so important, to the acquisition process. So definitely, of course, looking at bestsellers lists, looking at blogger lists, reader's choice picks, all those kind of things go into play when figuring out, is this project something that publishers are looking for? So, that's why, again, acquisitions are so difficult sometimes, because the idea may sound great, but you want to make sure you're not overpaying where you'll never make royalties, or the publisher will lose money and they won't offer you another book deal. So advances are nice, but it's not free money. It's money you have to earn back before you make royalties. And there are a lot of authors out there who have signed deals that never have seen royalties. They get their advance and then they never earn out. And sometimes this will make or break their careers, because then another publisher may not want to take a chance on them if they don't sell, or if they were overpaid and now they're expecting that same advance, even though they can't sell the amount of copies to sustain that advance.
That's really great insight. Thank you for that.
Of course.
For several years now, and I know that you're aware of this, readers, including authors who are readers, have voiced concerns about the lack of diversity in books, the multicultural voices, LGBTQIA+ voices, and books featuring people with disabilities. What do you think the publishing industry, meaning authors, agents, and publishers, can they do to address this?
Well, it's interesting, because before I jump into what they can do, I'm actually going to turn this back to the readers, because I remember doing surveys, talking to readers, and they're like, oh, we would love this and we would love that and we want this and we want that. And then I would go find those books and do them, and then there were no sales. So, I think there is a responsibility to the agents, editors, and publishers and authors to provide the content, but then the content is there and the readers are not buying it. They're loaning each other books. They're borrowing them from the libraries, which there's nothing wrong with that. But if you're talking about sales and helping to keep these books in print, you have to buy copies. You can't share, your copies with everyone. You have to encourage your people, book clubs especially, to buy the copies. And so when it comes to agents, I know I've heard from a lot of authors, there's not a lot of agents of color or, agents accepting queer stories. And so then they feel kind of like, well, can I trust this agent with my project? They don't even really get what I'm writing, or they're just trying to fill a quota but don't get it. Same applies in-house. There have been lots of opportunities. I've seen finally, more diverse books coming out, not just being published, but being supported, being promoted, being marketed, being in places that you wouldn't normally see these books as top picks, as summer beach reads, on New York Times book reviews, places where you might not see these books. You're seeing them now, which is great. But then there are still a few publishers who have not diversified their staff. And I think that's more important than diversifying your list. You can bring in diverse projects, but if you don't have the right people working on them, they're going to get lost, or not be published right. Or then you'll hear those horrible stories of, I had to whitewash my book, or even, I had to take out that part of my sexuality from my memoir, because people aren't ready to have that conversation. So, I think we are finally turning pages, because I've been having these diversity panel conversations for years. But I feel like within the last few years, we're finally seeing the content match the incentive, going beyond the conversation to really bring these projects in and to diversify staff. Because I think that's even more important than diversifying your list, is making sure you have the editors, making sure you have the publicists, the marketing people, the salespeople who get it and are not just going to say, well, I only know these channels and that's it, but really challenge themselves to learn more outlets and really, target additional outlets than the ones that they're used to going to.
Beautiful. And you've touched on something that I really want to emphasize on, because that's one of the reasons I really wanted to do Industry Insiders. I believe that readers have more power than we realize. The first thing you said was, even if we bring the books to market, if readers aren't purchasing them, they're not going to stay in the market.
Correct.
Correct.
So, I think it's twofold. We definitely are trying to get these books out there. But what's the worst thing that I experience as an acquisitions editor is to fight to get this particular project on the list, actually have them do the, support the book, and then the sales just aren't there. And it's just like, what do? You've promoted it, you've marketed it, the author's doing the social media, they're going to the conferences. What more can you do? That's when it gets a little frustrating, when you feel like you've tried everything and it's still not quite working.
But then I would think that it would be more than just frustrating, because if you fight and then you win, but then everything falls flat, the next time this fight comes back up, it's going to be that much harder to get the product out.
Right. That, and the flip side, the author may give up and decide, I'm done. And I've seen that happen a lot of times. Like, authors, they try their best, it doesn't work out, and it's already such a hard thing to do the book. It's already such an insecurity there to say, is my book good enough? Should I be doing this? And then when that type of thing happens, there are a lot of authors that are like, screw this, I'm going to go back to my day job. And, they give up on something that they really love. So it's so many ripple effects to, an unsuccessful publication. You do have some authors who use it as motivation to learn and try to do better with the next book, etc. You have some publishers that try to figure it out. But sometimes, yeah, and I definitely have had that happen. Like, okay, we gave you a shot, it didn't work. And so now the next one, no, maybe not. No, that's not it. So it's almost like you have to have a perfect, like it will sell itself project.
Wow.
Before they kind of let you bring something else that's kind of like a risk.
So it becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you're being told it won't sell, and you say, yes, it will, look at these survey results, and then boom, it doesn't sell.
Right. And it's like, see, this is why we don't do this.
Wow, you've really depressed me.
Yeah. I mean, luckily now I'm finding that there are more examples of success stories. So I'm hoping that momentum will continue. But that was what it was for a long time, at least for me. I can't speak for any other person, but for me, as an acquisitions editor, that was one of the challenges that I faced.
And I can understand that because it takes so much. And as you had said in part one of our interview, there aren't many diverse staff at publishing houses. So that takes extra courage to stand up there and say, okay, I am one voice, but I really need
listen to me. Exactly. Mm-hmm. It's definitely a challenge.
Yeah. How long did it take you to get them to listen to you?
I mean, it was kind of off and on. It depended on what I was acquiring, it depended on who I was acquiring. And it depended on what list I was acquiring for. So if the powers that be are not very open-minded, then you're not going to get into that space. And so then I would try to maneuver into other spaces and try to get things on other lists if it didn't quite work. And, and I think also as the editor, you have to have a vision for the books and kind of know what those questions are going to be, or kind of prepare yourself for the no's so you could turn them into yeses. And so it's almost like you have to be prepared to be on the defense, to defend your projects, where, I noticed like my white counterparts didn't have as many issues with that. Yes, it was a numbers game, but it would seem easier to give this person a chance than this person a chance. And that was really frustrating. And that's why I ultimately left corporate publishing. Again, I love the perks, love the staff, but I just felt stuck. I felt that I was losing my credibility. I felt I wasn't doing what I really felt like I should be doing. And I got tired. Like you were saying earlier, like you fight. And then it's like, it doesn't quite give you what you want. And then you're seeing all these people being promoted and they have half the list that you have and they're not doing as much. And it's just like, why am I here? Like, what is it that I'm doing? Or what am I doing wrong? And you start to internalize it. Like, maybe I'm doing something wrong. Maybe, there were so many times where I was like, is this even for me? Like, am I even in the right business? Like, maybe I don't know what I'm doing. How come my books just aren't working? How come this is not working? That's not working. And, I know a lot of editors that came up with me and they're no longer in publishing. It's burnout. You just get to a point where you're like, I can't do this anymore. And so a lot of people question my decision to leave a big corporate publisher to go to a smaller publisher. They were like, oh, people usually go reverse. Like, why would you do that? And it's because it's not just about the size of the publisher. It's what am I doing there? Which is also what I tell authors. Like, of course, who doesn't want to be with a big publisher? But if the big publisher is not going to do your book any justice, you want to publish with the place that's going to do right by you and your book. And there have been instances where smaller publishers have done better with certain types of books than bigger publishers because that's their thing and they really know how to do that thing. And so it was the same for me. It was like, if I'm here, but I'm not doing anything, does it matter where I'm at if I can do more here than there? Like, aren't we just looking for good books? So.
Yeah, that's what it boils down to. Oh, you have given us so much to think about. You've given us a lot of meat to sink into. I really appreciate that. So we're going to pause here. And viewers, hit the subscribe, the like, post a comment or question about this episode, and then tune in for part 3 of our interview with Latoya Smith. Until then, happy reading.